Hello everybody, my name is Kevin Non-Tradicath and I'm the non-traditional Catholic, maybe ex-Catholic, it kind of depends on how you define your terms, but yesterday I had a discussion for a forthcoming episode of Conversations with Catholics, and we talked about a bunch of things, but one of the things that we talked about was dualism. Now, we were talking about it kind of tangentially, but that prompted this video idea. I wrote a little essay that I'm going to present to you today that I'm titling Catholic Mind-Body Dualism, Medieval Science and the Problem of Dogma. On the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see the essay. You can read along, but I'll be presenting it to you. I will share this. There are links in the essay for you to follow so that you can fact-check everything that I say. The picture here is from the Council of Vienne in the 1300s. So, in this essay, I will argue that the Church is false because she committed herself dogmatically to mind-body dualism, which is false. A syllogism for this argument might look like this. Premise 1. If the Church holds dogmatically to any certain belief, and that belief is false, then the Church is false. Premise 2a. The Church holds dogmatically to mind-body dualism. Premise 2b. Mind-body dualism is false. Conclusion, therefore, the Church is false. Let's start by defending premise 2a. Premise 2a, the Church does dogmatically commit herself to mind-body dualism. So, what am I going to suggest backs up the claim that the Church is in fact committed to mind-body dualism? I will agree. The Church has never dogmatically stated, yeah, we commit ourselves to mind-body dualism, plain and simple. The Church doesn't always use philosophical language in that way. The Church speaks more theologically and less philosophically most of the time. But I still think that the Church has committed herself to dualism. And I'm not the only person who thinks this. This is kind of the prevailing Catholic opinion. So why do I say this? I wanted to pull two pieces of evidence. Really, there's only one piece of evidence that matters, but we'll start with the less important one. Aquinas was a dualist. In a blog post, Catholic philosopher Thomas Aquinas 2.0, Edward Feser, states, in particular, Aquinas holds that the human intellect is immaterial and that because it is the human soul of which it is a power survives the death of the body, and that is more than enough to make him a dualist, as dualism is generally understood today. To the vast majority of contemporary philosophers, to say Aquinas thinks that the soul is immaterial and survives the death of the body, but he isn't a dualist, sounds a little bit like saying Aquinas believed in the existence of God, but he's not a theist. That doesn't make much sense. I've included a link to this blog post by Edward Feser here, but suffice to say, Aquinas was definitely a dualist. Now, Aquinas doesn't speak for the Church. Maybe de facto he does, but he doesn't. You know, he said some things like hell has like legitimate, like actual fire in it, and the Church doesn't accept that today. So, Aquinas didn't get everything right, but we can do better than Aquinas. So I guess 100 years after Aquinas, we have the Council of Vienne in France. 1311 to 1312 AD. At the Council of Vienna, it is declared, anyone who presumes henceforth to assert, defend, or hold stubbornly that the rational intellectual soul is not the form of the human body of itself and essentially, is to be considered a heretic. So you're a heretic if you don't commit yourself to at least the fact that the rational soul is the form of the human body. I don't know how one could agree that the rational soul is the form of the human body without being committed to some kind of mind-body dualism. Or I should stipulate at least being stipulated to some form of dualism. You can read this whole encyclical from Vienna at the link below, papalencyclicals.net. But I think that those 2 points adequately defend the premise that the Church does dogmatically hold to mind-body dualism. Premise 2b, mind-body dualism is false. So before I launch into why I think that mind-body dualism is false, why does the Church think that mind-body dualism is true? Right? Like I shouldn't just start attacking it without trying to defend it first. So, Jimmy Akin, in a Catholic Answers podcast, defends mind-body dualism in 3 ways. Jimmy Akin says, And this is a transcription from a video that I pulled directly from Catholic Answers. So the wording is a little awkward, but listen to the recording if you want. I include a link down here to the CatholicAnswers.com article. And the article links to a YouTube video as well. So you can watch the video if you don't want to read it. But Jimmy Akin says that there are 3 ways of defending dualism. The first is that we can bring what he calls faith-based data to the discussion. By this, he means Scripture. Scripture teaches that the soul exists, that it's distinct from the body. But they were talking about Sam Harris earlier. He says that Sam Harris is not going to buy this because he's an atheist. So this, meaning the faith-based data, the Scripture data, is not, quote, the most productive line of discussion. Okay, I agree. Scripture is not the most productive line of discussion. Second, Jimmy says that the second would be philosophical discussion, and you can argue as philosophers, both Christian and non-Christian, have that this is a real distinction and that we need to take substance dualism seriously. Jimmy Akin, still talking about Sam Harris, goes on to say that he's not sure that he's considered these, but if he has considered them, clearly he rejects them because Sam Harris himself is not a dualist. Jimmy quickly moves on, though. I like Jimmy a lot. Jimmy's like a science guy, and I'm a science guy, right? So Jimmy kind of brushes past the philosophical discussion. Now, Jimmy has a great understanding of philosophy, of course, much better than I do. But in this short, this video is only 30 minutes or so. So Jimmy moves on. He moves on to science. He says, let's science, which I love. Let's see whether science actually supports that you can explain everything in purely material terms. One of the problems is what's known as the hard problem of consciousness, because it's clear that consciousness exists and that we have no idea how to begin to explain it in scientific terms. I'll disagree that we have no idea, but, close enough. Jimmy goes on to talk about near-death experiences. Jimmy says, based on preliminary evidence, there is evidence that some people are able to come back from death with true information, even though their brain was totally shut down. Okay, so Jimmy says we can support mind-body dualism 3 ways. One is with Scripture, but he admits that's not a great way. 2, philosophy, but he doesn't really go into any philosophical arguments. He just says some philosophers agree. And then number 3, he says science, and then he spends the most time on science, and he talks about near-death experiences. So I'm going to disagree on all 3 fronts, and I'm going to take it in reverse order. So Jimmy goes Scripture, philosophy, science, and I'm going to start with science, then move into philosophy, and then end with Scripture. So the scientific community disagrees with Jimmy. Obviously, the scientific community is not a monolith, but let's take a look at some scientific journal articles. Later, we'll look at some Phil papers. But we'll look at scientific journal articles on near-death experiences. So I've reviewed some scientific journal articles that I could find about near-death experiences, and I really could only find one thing that was universal in all of those papers, and that is that there is no consensus. From Near-Death Experience as a Probe to Explore Disconnected Consciousness, published in March 2020 in the science magazine Trends in Cognitive Sciences, we can see that we have, quote, we have a limited understanding of NDE phenomenon, near-death experience phenomenon. An important issue is that scientists use different descriptions that likely lead to distinct conclusions concerning the phenomenon and its causes. Advances in classical NDE understanding require that the concepts of wakefulness, connectedness, and internal awareness are adequately untangled. So this article clearly states that there's no conclusion that we can make right now. Let's look at another one. From Are Near-Death Experiences Veridical? A Philosophical Inquiry, published in June 2021 by Western University. The author for this piece mentions at the beginning of this essay that he sets out to actively prove that consciousness can exist after death. He admits that this is his goal. He says, the aim of my work is to defend the veridicality of near-death experiences within the framework of idealism. So he admits, he's like, yeah, I'm an idealist, and I want to prove to you that idealism has some teeth. So he's not unbiased, and in fact, he disagrees with me. This is a scientist who disagrees with me. Well, a scientist in training anyway, at least he's at university. But regardless, he sets out to prove me wrong, right? So I'm trying to argue against his hypothesis, and he's like, no. I'm going to demonstrate that NDEs are veridical, that they are, that they carry truth value. But guess what? The author of this article admits that this analysis is a non-starter. Due to the sensory modality used, the uncertainty of the exact aim of the experiments, the loose or non-existent definitions of life, death, dying, afterlife, and consciousness, it was determined that it is difficult to find at what point the possibility arises for continuation of consciousness apart from the brain. Basically, it's difficult to calculate at what point the dying process near-death experience occurs, whether they happen at a point where the brain can still support consciousness or whether they happen afterwards. It is simply the case that the threshold for an independent existence of consciousness cannot be established using empirical evidence, because the defenders of the dying brain hypothesis can offer some kind of explanation for all evidence. I agree. It is nearly impossible for these types of things to be falsified. Now, specific claims can be falsified, but the dying brain hypothesis seems to make far fewer assumptions than the idealist NDE mind-body dualist explanation makes. So it's more parsimonious. And it explains the evidence in the same way. So it seems far more likely to me that the dying brain hypothesis is correct. And without getting into it, the dying brain hypothesis is just that, hey, like, look, when you're dying, your brain kind of just pumps your body full of, serotonin and other chemicals to make your passing a little bit easier. And, that's going to cause you to have some crazy dreams and stuff. And so when you wake up, you're like, oh man, I had like all sorts of conscious experiences. Anyway. And then I also want to end on, we know of some famous near-death experiences that later turned out to be false. Famous NDEs where the person later recanted, saying that experience was not true. It was made up. The most famous of which is The Boy Who Came Back from Heaven, a 2010 Christian book that purported to tell the story of Alex Malarkey and his experiences in heaven after a traffic accident in 2004. It was published by Tyndale House Publishers in 2010. Alex's father, Kevin Malarkey, is credited as a co-author along with Alex, although Kevin holds the sole copyright. The book was a commercial success, selling over 1 million copies, and it was adapted into a television film in March of 2010. But since its publication, Alex and his mother have both disavowed the book. Alex commented online in 2011, only a year after publication, that it was one of the most deceptive books ever. And he wrote an extensive repudiation in an open letter to Christian bookstores in 2015, describing his near-death experience as a fabrication. As a result, Tyndale House removed the book from print, and Christian bookstores have removed it from their shelves. Since we know that the science of near-death experiences is not settled, and we also know that people lie about NDEs for fame, I think that we should approach NDEs with much, much skepticism. Further studies need to be done, no doubt. Further studies should always be done. But I will argue that at present we have no reason to believe that NDEs are veridical. NDEs strike me as every other pseudoscience, and I haven't seen enough data. Jimmy Akin mentions that there's some preliminary data. I've spent a decent amount of time looking up near-death experience data, and I have found nothing like that. If Jimmy quoted a source, I would have checked it out. He didn't quote a source. If I ever get to talk to Jimmy one day, this is what I'm going to ask him about: NDEs, among other things. But I don't see that preliminary data anywhere. And I'm really, really skeptical that such data actually exists. Okay, that was the only argument that Jimmy brought for science. Now, maybe Jimmy thinks about other science reasons to be a mind-body dualist, but he doesn't list any, and so I disagree with the only scientific, piece of evidence that Jimmy puts forward. So let's move on to the second of the three reasons, the philosophical argumentation. So I mentioned that I still disagree with the philosophical argumentation, and this is true. I'm not alone here. The link below, right here, the Springer link, contains a list of philosophers who agree that the conservation of energy is incompatible with mind-body dualism. This idea started in force with Descartes during the Enlightenment. Now, Descartes himself was actually a dualist. He was a theist, but Descartes kind of laid the framework that later turned into a pretty broad rejection of mind-body dualism. And the consensus view of philosophers today is that mind-body dualism is false. According to Phil Papers, only 22% of philosophers are mind-body dualists. And I would not be surprised if the vast majority of that 22% of philosophers are religiously committed to mind-body dualism. Somebody like Fraser is absolutely a mind-body dualist, and Fraser is not at liberty to disagree with mind-body dualism because Fraser is Catholic. If Fraser was to disagree with mind-body dualism, he would cease being Catholic, or at least he would be, as Catholic as I am, right? And I kind of call myself Catholic, so we'll see. But anyway, I grabbed 3 quotes from this link, but I would encourage you to open up this link and check other quotes as well. I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce this philosopher's name, but there's a work published in 1980 called The Mind-Body Problem, a Psychobiological Approach. Bungie, that's how I'm going to say his name, 1980, page 17. Dualism violates conservation of energy. If immaterial mind could move matter, then it would create energy. And if matter were to act on immaterial mind, then energy would disappear. In either case, energy, a property of all and only concrete things, would fail to be conserved. So, physics, chemistry, biology, and then he also mentions economics, which I don't actually agree with, but would collapse. Faced with a choice between these hard sciences, of which economics is not a hard science, but regardless, and primitive superstition, we opt for the former. I agree, physics and chemistry would fall apart without the law of conservation of energy. I am more certain of the law of conservation of energy than I am about most other things. Like, conservation of energy is on the same level as gravity. So, if you don't know, my degree is in chemical engineering, so my entire degree is physics and chemistry and math. This is the foundation of chemistry and physics, the law of conservation of energy. Mind-body dualism breaks the law of conservation of energy. Because of that, I reject mind-body dualism. Another quote from Daniel Dennett, like one of the horsemen. So in his 1991 work, Consciousness Explained, Dennett goes on to say, it is the principle of conservation of energy that accounts for the physical impossibility of perpetual motion machines. And the same principle is apparently violated by dualism. This confrontation between quite standard physics and dualism has been endlessly discussed since Descartes' own day, and it is widely regarded as the inescapable and fatal flaw of dualism. Yeah, I mentioned Descartes earlier, and Descartes himself was kind of a dualist. But Descartes laid the groundwork that eventually led to the downfall of dualism. I think dualism is dead in the water because of the law of conservation of energy. One more. This one coming from Leibniz, 1985, in his essay Theodicy, Essays on the Goodness of God and the Freedom of Man and the Origin of Evil. He says, 2 important truths on the subject have been discovered since Descartes' day. The first is that the quantity of absolute force, which is in fact conserved, is different from the quantity of movement, as I have demonstrated elsewhere. The second discovery is that the same direction is still conserved in all bodies together and is assumed they're interacting. In whatever way, they still come into collision. If this rule had been known to Descartes, he would have been taken. He would have taken the direction of bodies to be independent of the soul as their force. And I believe that this would have led direct to the hypothesis of pre-established harmony, whither these same rules have led me. For apart from the fact that the physical influence of one of these substances on the other is inexplicable, I recognize that without a complete derangement of the laws of nature, the soul could not physically act upon the body. Again, with reference to Descartes. Mind-body dualism is inescapable and fatally flawed. If true, then physics as we know it is false. Chemistry as we know it is false. The laws of nature would be wrong. This is massive, massive. And I don't think that Catholics really wrestle with this as much as they should. So where does that leave us? Jimmy Akin had, science and philosophy. We disagreed with science. We disagreed with philosophy. Scripture. Jimmy Akin refers to this as faith-based data, and he admits that this is not the most productive line of discussion. Catholics and I probably agree that being in a holy text alone is not enough for someone to accept something as true. Catholics don't accept things that are true in other religions' holy texts, if that was the only reason to accept it anyway. So Catholics don't accept that the prophet split the moon in half, as is stated in one of the Islamic holy texts. And Catholics don't even accept everything in their own holy books as literal anyway, like, the age of the earth. And then even like the epistles of Peter, like, some more liberal Catholics like Father Raymond Brown accept that the epistles of Peter, even though they claim to be written by Peter, were not written by Peter. So it wouldn't surprise me if one day Catholics view mind-body separation, mind-body dualism, in the same way that they view like creationism. So I've been monologuing for 20 minutes, so let's get to the conclusion. Let's revisit the syllogism from the introduction. Premise 1, if the church holds dogmatically to any certain belief, and that belief is false, then the church is false. I doubt that any Catholic would disagree with me here. It's a big world. Some would disagree with me, but this seems to be fine. I don't think Catholics would disagree. Premise 2a, the church holds dogmatically to mind-body dualism. Most Catholics do seem to think that mind-body dualism was dogmatically defined in the 14th century. But I actually could see the church moving on this eventually, in the same way that the church has moved on the death penalty and things like slavery. This is likely where I would choose to attack my argument if I was to play devil's advocate. Maybe belief in the soul does not actually entail mind-body dualism. Maybe the soul is a metaphor and we actually do exist within a deterministic universe, but the soul is, a metaphor. I don't know. If I was going to attack my own argument, I would attack premise 2a. Premise 2b, mind-body dualism is false. I'm highly confident that this is the case. This very well may be my empiricist side coming through, thanks to my engineering education, but I cannot see around the problem of conservation of energy. Conclusion. Therefore, the church is false. This follows from my premises. I titled this essay, Medieval Science and the Problem of Dogma. The Council of Vienne declared that mind-body dualism is dogmatic in 1312 AD, at least according to most Catholics. René Descartes, the father of modern philosophy, was born in 1596, nearly 300 years after the Council at Vienna. And his pioneering work changed the philosophical landscape. Descartes paved the way for Locke, who paved the way for Hume, who paved the way for Huxley, and the philosophical consensus moved further and further away from mind-body dualism. By the end of the 19th century, so by the 1890s, the mechanism of Huxley was clearly winning over the dualism of the past. But the church could not change what it had set in stone in the 1300s. And this is the fatal flaw of the Catholic Church. Thanks, everybody. I look forward to engaging with you in the comments. If you disagree with me, let me know. Leave a comment. Shoot me an email. Come on Conversations with Catholics and show me where I went wrong. But I think that the problem of the conservation of energy is actually a really good reason to not be Catholic, or at least to be as Catholic as I am. With that, I've been Kevin Non-Tradicath, the non-traditional Catholic, maybe ex-Catholic. If you like defending your faith and you're a Catholic and you want to defend it, subscribe to my channel. Like the video or dislike the video. But whatever you do, let me know what you think. And until next time.